There's a handout, actually 2 handouts. You should get those, so if you were here from the last session, you should do that. Also, I'll just mention with my best rhetorician's ethos that although I usually think of the pillars of rhetoric mostly as audience and purpose, some people also include place, and I think that's appropriate here because this is really not a good place for a small sectional, and you should really come down towards the front just because I will feel less intimidated. But if you insist on sitting in the back, I will yell at you. Which might mean you don't hear it. Oh, look at that.
And I'm from the front row. I'm doing this. I love it.
Okay, I am going to start on time because I am aware from having done this session before that I have a little more material than the time really allows. Please, so do make sure you get a handout. Anybody else, you can just help them get those later. My name is Heather Judd. I am a teacher at Mount Hope Lutheran School in Casper, Wyoming. I have taught there now, just finished my 11th year of teaching in total. And I mostly teach 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. I'm not an expert on the Progymnasmata, but I am an enthusiast for it, having begun to do more of the exercises to work through a few more of these things. Let me just get a feel. I'm assuming most of you have at least heard the term Progymnasmata. How many of you, that's about the extent of what you know? You've heard the term, but you know very little else. Okay. How many of you have actually taught some of this to students, children? All right. This is going to be a whirlwind tour, and there are probably lots of things that I may not really explain in detail for you, but I think you'll be able to catch on and figure out. So my focus here is really on the aspect of virtue, since this is our conference theme, in these Progymnasmata exercises. So this is why I'm calling this rhetorical training to recognize, contemplate, and emulate virtue. That's what we'll be looking at. So we're going to start from the point of comparison to think a little bit about just what I'll generally call modern composition. So here's your quick survey. Please raise your hand if you have ever given as an assignment or had to write as an assignment what I did on my summer vacation. Anybody had to do this before? Oh, fantastic. How about write a story from your imagination? That's all you're told to do, right? Okay. Keep a daily journal of your thoughts and feelings. Whatever, anything that happened. Yeah. Or write the favorite 5-paragraph essay. Either to be about expository, something that a thing that you like, or argumentative, persuade me about this thing. Write a 5-paragraph essay. These I think for most of us are very familiar exercises. This is the sort of bread and butter of modern composition. I think there's some weaknesses with this, which is one of the reasons I think we should really advocate for the Progymnasmata. So here are the weaknesses, a few of them at least, that I see in here. First of all, and I'm sorry, I am on my outline here, we're on A2 by now. Weaknesses, they're lacking in a clear audience or purpose. Any topic you want to write about for your 5-paragraph essay is fine. What I did for my summer vacation. Presumably you're writing for your teacher, but you're not really thinking about your audience very much. And what's the purpose of this? Well, to write something. Write a story from imagination. It doesn't have a very clear purpose or audience to it. The other thing, perhaps a little bit more noticeable to us, is that these are based on personal opinion or experience, almost exclusively. And that's something to keep in mind as we start to look through the Progymnasmata exercises, which I do not think that is the case. If you combine having no clear audience and purpose with basing everything on personal opinion and experience, in most cases, unless you're an exceptional student, you're going to end up more or less with vacuous, vague content. Because students, frankly, don't have enough personal, real-life experience to write worthwhile things just based off of what's inside of them. Besides that, we notice that where are they looking for inspiration? Inside of them. We have good theology. We know what's inside of children. It's not a good place to look for inspiration. This is something to keep in mind. So I look at these kind of modern composition exercises, and I think it's a form of neo-sophistry. The sophists, 1 and 2, they would show you how they could argue either side of the case and win it. Because the purpose of rhetoric is just to persuade, I can do cool stuff with words. That's not our purpose. Okay? So these kind of modern composition exercises, the primary goal is usually just you need to be able to give reasons or explanations to support your opinions or your argument. I did some research on the Common Core last summer, and you look at a lot of the standards for writing there, and that's essentially what it is. You want students to be able just to give reasons to support what they say. We need to think about the broader scope. Because what happens then, point B, all opinions and all arguments are valid so long as they are your own. I really don't care what you want to argue for, as long as you give me evidence. You've now fulfilled my writing criteria. That's not a good place to be going. So because these are then utterly lacking in a moral framework. There's no such thing as a moral belief. There are facts and there are opinions, and there is no morality. There is nothing that is in itself right or wrong. Okay? So this is why I think it's important that we look at these things, is because what seem like the most innocuous sort of composition exercises may be taking us places that we don't really want to head with our students. So we're going to now go back to classical rhetoric. Again, I'm not an expert in classical rhetoric, I just happen to be enthusiastic about it. I'm sure there's a lot I could learn, and I know there are experts in the room that probably can tell you more on some of these things. So, this is the practical teacher's aspect. We often start with Aristotle, his definition that rhetoric is the faculty of observing in any given case the available means of persuasion. Pretty dry definition, and this leaves open to us essentially still the sophist tendencies that you can, as long as all we're worried about is just persuading. I tend to like Quintilian's definition here. I have a wonderful headmistress who's been making us read Quintilian for our weekly faculty meetings, and there's a lot of good stuff in there. Quintilian has a definite moral aspect when he talks about rhetoric. Okay? So he says, rhetoric is the science of speaking well, essentially taking Aristotle. This includes all the virtues of speech in one formula, and at the same time also the character of the orator, because only a good man can speak well. Okay? And so his distinct definition is that the rhetorician is a good man skilled in speaking. I think it's significant even when he puts that first. You first have to be a good man and then skilled in speaking. If you're not a good man, who cares if you're skilled in speaking? Because you'll be convincing people to do something wrong. Now here is the terrifying and wonderful thing. That's us. As teachers, or pastors, or parents, we are to be the good man skilled in speaking. You're the rhetorician for your students. It's a huge task, but it's a good one. All right, so on to the next page, some hallmarks of classical rhetoric. Classical rhetoric keeps in mind audience and purpose as its pillars. It is not done in a vacuum. It is not done purely from your imagination. It is not your individual little world. You're thinking of other people when you're doing this. You have neighbors, and rhetoric speaks to them. It is also based on persuading to the good, the true, and the beautiful. Not just to why blue is better than red, but to something that actually has some substance to it. The content then would be inherently moral and true, or it calls out what is immoral or false. Again, there are some of these exercises where we see they don't have as strong of a moral content to them. But the overarching world of rhetoric, it's tied in with morality all over the place. And this distinction I don't claim as my own, but I really like this, is that rhetoric seeks truth for the sake of the neighbor. Okay? It's not for me to win the argument, it's for me to persuade my neighbor to what is good, true, and beautiful. Versus logic, where you're studying truth for the sake of truth. I want to know the truth in logic, but it's not so concerned with how it interacts with my neighbor. So if we take these then, what I'm calling modern composition and classical rhetoric, and we compare them, some points of contrast. Classical rhetoric is rooted in actual points of dispute instead of neutral situations. And I've got a quote about that in just a moment we're going to get to. It tends to deal with absolutes instead of opinions. Opinion is pretty low on the totem pole in terms of what we want to consider important. We want to look at what is actually good, true, and beautiful. Also, classical rhetoric is focused on humane issues. Things such as what it means to be human, how ought humans to act, instead of the non-human or individualistic topics. And again, there are some exceptions to this, but in the overarching scheme, I'm not concerned about, just you personally, what you did on your summer vacation, because it doesn't relate to the rest of humanity. And from a Lutheran perspective, it doesn't relate to your neighbor in a very meaningful way. Okay? I also think this is wonderful, and again, terrifying, because in this way, the teacher and the student are in a sense equal. I am a human being maturing in my understanding, learning to care for my neighbor just as much as my students are. And so the things that are good for them are also good for me, or vice versa. What I'm teaching them is things that I also need to hear. I've lived enough years that I really don't need to continue to go on to tell you about what I've done on my summer vacation, although I've had a pretty awesome summer this year. But I do need to think about how to serve my neighbor all the time, and so do my students. And so we're growing in this together. This quote is from a book, I didn't bring this one with me, but Ancient Rhetorics for Contemporary Students. And the authors point out, what interested ancient rhetoricians were issues, matters about which there was some disagreement or dispute. In other words, nothing can become an issue unless someone disagrees with someone else about its truth or falsity, or applicability or worth. Issues do not exist in isolation from the people who speak or write about them. So whereas I think, again, a lot of modern composition tries to avoid dispute. We try to take topics, yes, we do persuasive essays, but really we're sticking to topics that nobody cares about, that there isn't a real point of dispute. And classical rhetoric is going to take us very quickly into dealing with real meaningful issues. Okay, before we go on, a few things on teaching virtue. A lot of other presenters at this conference have said many things better than I have, and I'll try not to go too far down any side roads. The primary textbook, if you will, on virtue that your students have is you, as a teacher, as a parent. This is why in classical rhetoric we establish your ethos, the ethical aspect, because you have a relationship to the people you're writing to or speaking to. You are there to lead them into morality in some way. And how you speak reveals something about your character. Not just the content, it's the content, the way in which you speak, the things that you have to say all reveal something about your character. I think we can also start to realize that any time we're talking about something that involves human actions, we can think of it in terms of virtue and vice. Again, I don't want to confuse this with theological issues. I think we need good, clear, strong theology that forgives our sins and doesn't make us feel as though we're not living up to the standard of virtue. But when we engage with literature, one of the things in literature that I found is something I'm trying to do is not ask my students, did you like that book? Because they give me inane answers, frankly. No, the cat died at the end. The cat wasn't even a major character, but you don't like the book because of this. They can't really form very useful opinions, even. Instead, I'll try and lead them down, well, what was good about this book? And then we'll talk about what we mean by good. It doesn't mean, did you like it? Okay. History, you get very complex characters. And so here, I tend to think it's probably better in history to tend towards not talking about our characters, our historical figures, necessarily a virtuous man, a vicious man. It's pretty hard to draw those distinctions sometimes. Take Thomas Jefferson or Martin Luther or other people. They're a mixture of these things. But we can't talk about actions as being virtuous or vicious. And I think that's a wise thing to do. Scriptures, again, we see examples of these things, and of course we have clear theology from this as well. So for writing, the one thing I'll say is, I think we should just consider, not all writing has to touch on moral issues, but if it doesn't touch on moral issues, just think carefully about then what is your other purpose for it? Really, why are we doing this? It's something we can continue to explore. I'll add one more that I don't really have on the list, and I think this is the way we handle our children's behavior. I teach 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. They're known for just being mature and polite and wonderful all the time, of course. But I've come to realize that it does not serve them well to just write them off as bratty, snotty teenagers who just can't help it because their brain development is there. That may be true, but I'm not going to tell them that. Instead, I'm going to speak to them quite frankly and openly about the fact that I want them to mature into complete, mature human beings. And that I believe that there are better things, that the way that they're acting now could be directed to a better end. It sometimes brings them up short, and is sometimes effective, and sometimes it's not. But that's the way of teenagers. A few more things about teaching virtue. It is a lifelong endeavor. It's not Ben Franklin autobiography. Here's my list of the 10 virtues I'd like to have. I will work on each one for a day each week until I have mastered all the virtues, and then gets frustrated when that somehow doesn't work out. Since it's a lifelong endeavor, this goes back to that reason that it is for you as the teacher as well as for your students. This is the wonderful thing about teaching Progymnasmata, which I promised we were actually getting to, is that it actually feeds you morally as well as your students. And something in our world that competes in many ways for our attention, asking us to multitask all the time, we need to consider that this is something that requires time for contemplation. You cannot just do I was homeschooled, and we didn't know about Lutheran or classical things, and so we used Becca textbooks for literature. And I remember very clearly my 9th grade book that here's the section on the virtue of patience. Here's the one on courage. Here's the one on temperance. And it sort of assumed that if you read the 4 or 5 stories in each of those sections, you would be a great virtuous person. Check, done that. You have to keep going back to things. You have to keep thinking over them. You have to let it soak in. All right, on to the actual Progymnasmata. I'll give you a brief definition since this is kind of new to a lot of you. Progymnasmata are essentially a set of exercises that would be done by children, and age ranges, you find all kinds of different sources telling you what the age ranges would be. Let's say from somewhere around the age of 8 to 16, we could expand or contract that on either end. This would be done in preparation for the specific rhetorical training where they would begin to write full declamations and do that sort of thing. So this is a series of exercises. They're very well broken down, and they're leading up to that goal, which we're not really going to get to talk about a whole lot today. So we start at the end. You tell us our end goal. Where do we hope to arrive? So these are preparations for complete practice orations, those declamations, or the gymnasmata, which is why these are the Progymnasmata. And these work through, we want to arrive at the specific and pragmatic. The point of rhetoric in the ancient world was basically judicial and civil. You needed to be able to defend yourself in court in ancient Athens because your life was on the line and you're your own defense attorney. And in Rome, you are in the Senate and you need to be able to present things in a way that will sway your peers. So those were very specific purposes that all of this education is heading toward. But these exercises start with the general and the abstract to get there. We're not going to start talking about the current events of today in these exercises. We're going to take things from literature, from history, general things to get there. All of these exercises are related to the parts of an oration. An oration, again, which we won't really talk about in detail, had very specific parts to it. So it has an introduction, a statement of facts, or a narration. That's sometimes called the division, proof, refutation, conclusion. Okay, so it's a very set form that you're heading towards. As a training program, Progymnasmata is a very complete training program. These exercises are carefully selected and ordered. It's hard for us to see that right away. If you don't have familiarity with this, you look at this list of things and think, well, those are interesting things to do, okay. But I hope you'll see a little bit today how carefully ordered they are. They're building on each other. They are focused exercises. That is, they are not aimed at practical, polished end products. The second handout I gave you that I may not get time to go over with you shows an example of an assignment I did with my students this past year. And you can see at the end you have a sample essay that was my sample for them to see. And it's an okay essay, but it's kind of weird and jarring because it has these different sections to it. That's how it's supposed to be. It's not supposed to create a polished piece of writing that you're going to get published in some journal. These exercises are also cumulative in nature. They really do build on each other, and I'll try and point that out as we go. They cover all 5 canons of rhetoric. So it's easy for us to see invention, how do you come about with ideas, arrangement, how do you put things in order, style, I won't touch on a lot today, but that was incorporated as well, but also memory and delivery, which I'll just put out a plug that we probably need to be thinking more about that as classical educators, the fact that we usually aren't making our students actually memorize and orally present their compositions. I don't have time to do that, or nerve, or something, but it's something we should probably be thinking about. These exercises also cultivate the mind. I use that word intentionally, to cultivate, to sow seeds and care for them so that they grow. So they work on the memory. They also work on the way in which you think. They give you logical ways to think. They give you flexible ways to think, to solve your way out of a tough rhetorical situation. And they give you persuasive ways to think. How do you appeal to people when truth is on the line and you want them to believe it? These also, they nourish the idea of copia. That is, having in your mental library a large variety of resources. Lots of things that you can draw on as you need to speak to others. They provide a good combination of guidance with freedom. They don't just tell you the annoying assignment that I always hated, go write a story. I don't know, I have no guidance. What am I supposed to write? They give you Loki, places that you start from and then you jump off. And from there, you can do a lot of variety, actually, but within very strict guidelines, which I'm convinced is actually much better for creativity than just telling people, go do it. But, like all training exercises, they require lots of repetition and practice. That means, I did, I think, 5 Maxima Priya essays with my students last year, and they were starting to catch on by the 5th one. It could have used a lot more. It also is lots of repetition and practice for the teacher. Okay, I'm not going to tell you this isn't a lot of work to learn to do this yourself. It is. So, the actual exercises themselves. There are several different ways that they can be numbered. That's really sort of neither here nor there. There are some different orderings of them. Some of them get switched around a little bit. We have, if you are interested, you can look at this afterwards. This is an English translation of basically 5 major sources that we have that were Progymnasmata textbooks. And let's see, I think we have the earliest one that we have that's strictly Progymnasmata textbook is Theon, who was writing 1st century AD. Hermogenes is 2nd century. Nicholas, 4th century. Aphthonius, probably the most widely used after his time. He's 5th century. And then this book also has a commentary by John of Sardis, who's 9th century.
What's the name of the book?
The name of the book is Progymnasmata, Greek Textbooks of Prose Composition and Rhetoric. The translator is George A. Kennedy. I will leave those here if you want to look at them later. So, going into the exercises themselves, I want to start with the idea that these exercises begin with the assumption that we can recognize virtue in stories. Okay? So think about the kind of stories that we encounter, that we give to children to read. See Spot run. Run, Spot, run. 0 morals there, pretty much. I don't know, we can maybe argue for some. Or think about most children's books. Think about young adult novels. What kind of morality do these have? Either none, amoral or immoral is usually the answer. Okay? On the other hand, we don't need to go down the road of moralizing sort of stories like when I was in a very pious stage as a young child and I read all the Mennonite novels about the families who, all worked on the farm and were punished when they did bad things and were very sorry for their bad things. They were terrible. I liked them at the time, but I realize now what bad theology. However, good stories have something to say to us about morality. Okay? So you can think about this as you encounter stories. And this doesn't necessarily mean that they present good morality. Sometimes they present immorality, but in such a way that we recognize it and we reject it. It brings the proper reaction from us. So a few things that Quintilian has to say about this, and I'll just point out there is a typo. The 4th line of this first quotation should be Homer and Virgil, not Home and Virgil. So Quintilian says, the other aspects of reading require important cautions. Above all, these tender minds, which will be deeply affected by whatever is impressed upon them in their untrained ignorance, should learn not only eloquent passages, but even more, passages which are morally improving. The practice of making students start with Homer and Virgil is therefore excellent. Of course, it needs a more developed judgment to appreciate their virtues. But there's time enough for this, for they will be read more than once. Hint, hint, we should be promoting this. Read them more than once. Meanwhile, let the mind be uplifted by the sublimity of the heroic poems, and inspired and filled with the highest principles by the greatness of their theme. I think it's very interesting. He points out, if we give children stories that have a good moral element to them, they don't have to understand and get the whole piece of moral instruction at this time, because it's going to soak in, and they'll come back to it, and they'll understand it more. And he also mentions here, shortly after that, But with boys, the text to be read should be those which will best nourish the mind and develop the character. Life will give time enough for the rest, which are important only for academic scholarship. This sort of strikes out against a lot of the tendency to do mostly nonfiction reading in upper levels of high school. Not within our classical schools, perhaps, but in the world at large. Give them things that can nourish the mind. All right, so the first exercise in almost all the orderings is fable. So you start this with your young children, and you can start with very, very young children. You start by just reading lots of good fables to them and having them tell you the fables back. Very useful. We start with fable because it's short, it's easily understood. Virtue and vice are clearly spelled out, as in the moral is, give the moral. So it's very clear for them to see. And also, animals and unnamed humans provide moral clarity. What I mean by this is, the fox in the story, you can just say he's bad. And it's pretty much fine to just say he's bad because he's a stock character, or in Dr. V's presentation. And it's okay. You don't have to, he's not a round character. We have to say, well, but the fox might have had a bad home life and mistreated it. No, he's just bad. Okay? And children at young ages crave that black and white distinction. And this is a good place to give it to them. Besides that, you're starting to build the mental library. Okay? They're going to use these fables in later exercises when they need to have a literary example that shows a particular virtue. So you start to just fill their minds. Hermogenes notes, fable is regarded as the first exercise to be assigned to the young because it can bring their minds into harmony for the better. Nicholas says, now, fable clearly belongs to the deliberative kind of speech, for we are exhorting to good deeds or dissuading from errors. We're not just telling a story, we're actually have a moral purpose. In addition to its power of enchantment, it benefits those who are persuaded, dissuading them from bad things, advising them to desire good things, and together with its sweetness, accustoming them to take advantage of its benefit. It speaks to the soul. It moves us to these things. From there, the next exercise that students would do would be rewriting longer narratives. And this could be moderately longer, it could be a lot longer. You can do things with this where you start in the middle and do in medias res, go backwards to it, all those kinds of things. But essentially we're taking now a longer story. This might be literary, it might be historical. Those would be the two main sources you pull from. So it's expanding the skill of retelling, but it also gives you more complex characters. And so, yes, these characters probably are basically virtuous or basically vicious, but they're not as black and white as the fable characters. And so students have to think about them a little differently. The plot is also more complex. And so Theon gives us the questions, the who, what, when, where, how, and why that you consider as you rewrite these things. So stories, these longer narratives, they do have moral elements, but they don't give you just one, here's the moral of the story. And in fact, this is very useful because you might take something, a scene from the Odyssey, say, and find that it doesn't have just one single simple moral to it, but rather a number of moral lessons that could be drawn from it and that may be useful for later on. So those first couple exercises, you're just learning to recognize virtue and vice and see them in story. The next set kind of goes on to thinking about it at a deeper level, contemplating virtue as it appears in word and deed. The maxim and kriya essay exercises are actually two, usually listed separately, but they're very, very similar. Maxims, wise sayings, kriyas, little anecdotes or sayings attributed to a specific person, time, place. So the purpose of these exercises is to explain and defend a wise saying. And you do this through multiple angles of consideration. So an encomium, you praise the speaker who did this, so you have to know something about the person. Again, audience and purpose are very clearly part of the rhetoric here that you can't just quote somebody out of context. You need to know something about that person. You paraphrase the saying, so you have to understand it well enough to put it in your own words. You give a cause. So, okay, if I follow the maxim that fire tests gold, adversity strong men, what will my life look like if I follow that maxim? And then the opposite, well, what will my life look like if I ignore the advice of that maxim? You give an analogy. Students are starting to think in terms of analogies. They'll use that later on. Okay? An example, you here give a literary or historical example that supports the wisdom of that saying. Where will you get those? Oh wait, you've done fable and narrative. You have a mental library of these things, and so you bring them into your writing. Testimony, these are quotations from other sources, so you're again learning these things from other places, and an epilogue that sums it up. As I mentioned, I'm not going to have time to go through it, but you can look through that other handout to see an example of how that plays out a little bit. Theon says of this exercise, surely the exercise in the form of the Kriya not only creates a certain faculty of speech, but also good character while we are being exercised in the moral sayings of the wise. I can tell you from experience, you don't get through one of these sorts of essays in one day with your students if they're 6th through 8th grade level, unless you are more talented than I am. Which means you have to take a good amount of time from your school week to work through these things and think about them. And they bring me quotations that have the word patience in there because my maxim was about patience. And it says the opposite of what the advice was. And I have to tell them to go back and look again. And then they bring me a story and they're like, well, I think this person is being patient. And, no, sorry, that's not it. Go look again. They have to think about it for a long time and ponder on those things. All right, moving on then to refutation and confirmation. Here you're going to take a narrative and condemn or defend it. So you now can combine exercises 2 and 3 in a new way. We know narrative. We know how to examine something to see the virtue in it. And so now we're going to take something longer than a maxim. We'll take a narrative and think about it in these terms. Again, multiple angles of consideration. So you look at the narrative and assess its clarity, credibility, possibility, plausibility, propriety, and profitability. The last two sort of being the moral elements there as well. So you're building up. Now you're looking at it in a larger context and examining these things. Commonplace. Now we go from looking at a specific narrative to thinking about a vice or a virtue in the abstract. So you've seen examples of virtue and vice as you've done fable and you've done narrative. You've practiced how to examine it by doing the maxim and kriya essays. You've practiced how to recognize and deal appropriately with it in narratives. And now you're going to look at the virtue or vice itself. Why is it so good or so evil? So you use your previous exercises and you're going to define what the virtue or vice is, give an example of the opposite of it, compare it, bring in a maxim about it, think about it in historical context, have a conclusion. So you're building all these things together. And again, you're contemplating virtue or vice constantly. Theon says one should construct the argument from the moral choice made by those who have done the deeds, and from the magnitude of the evil actions they perform, and from what others suffer because of them, and also from the return that they themselves get. Okay? So you're starting to see how does virtue and vice affect people's lives. The next one then, number 6, encomium and invective or vituperation. This one takes this, and we now go to looking at an actual person. So you're going to praise a virtuous man or condemn a vicious one. So you're taking this now and applying it directly to a person. This is often applied to a literary person or perhaps a historical person, not likely to a living person. Which the living person you're going to do in your judicial things later on, but you don't do this. And if you think about the age of students we're doing this with, so young teenagers, do you want them to write about whether their classmate is virtuous or vicious? Oh, no. They can find vice in other people really easily. It's really amazing. So again, you draw on all the previous skills, and you're heading towards that ultimate goal of being able to defend or condemn somebody in court, or to speak about someone in the Senate. So you have a pronoun, the introduction. You talk about the origins of the person. This is something interesting for us to think about, that's part of the person's character. The upbringing, the deeds. You make a comparison with someone else, right? Epilogue. So you're seeing now virtue and vice in a specific person and assessing what is it that makes this person this way. Quintilian on this one says, this is useful in more ways than one. The mind is exercised by the variety and multiplicity of the material. The character is molded by the contemplation of right and wrong. So notice it comes back on you. You're looking at somebody else's virtue and vice, but who's being changed by it? I am, because I'm assessing their virtue and vice. A wide knowledge of facts is acquired. You're building copia again. And this provides the speaker with a ready-made store of examples, a very powerful resource in all sorts of cases, which you will use when occasion demands. All right, number 7 is comparison. This essentially takes exercise 6 and it doubles it. So you have either a double encomium, we have 2 good virtuous men, and I'm going to compare them and decide which is more virtuous. Or I have 2 vicious men, and I'm going to compare them and see which is more despicable. So we also then have a persuasive element coming in here, but you notice that we really are heading now, we've gone from fable, very black and white, to something where we see the gray areas and we're going to call them out. We're going to see, okay, I have 2 people who are virtuous, but there are degrees of this, and how do I compare this? So even stronger purpose here of condemning vice and commending virtue, you're looking at that very specifically. Quintilian says that this rests on a similar principle, but doubles the material and handles not only the nature of virtues and vices, but their degree. So we're acknowledging that things are not clear-cut all the time. Okay? In theological terms, we might point out that people can be virtuous and yet be sinners. Okay? The last set of exercises here, I think beyond this point, they go from simply being able to recognize and assess what's going on with virtue and vice, to actually trying to emulate virtue for the good of the self and the neighbor. You've seen it, you've analyzed it, you're going to now put it into practice. Number 8 here, characterization. Also, you may find this one called personification, prosopopia, or epipoeia. This is a monologue in the style of a certain literary or historical figure. So if you're familiar, in English, we're often familiar with the poems of Robert Browning and his dramatic monologues. A lot of people have read My Last Duchess, and it's just one character speaking, but by what he says and does not say, you figure out by the end that he's murdered his wife. It's really quite powerful. And again, this is where I say the manner of your speaking tells something about your character. Okay? It requires an understanding of the person's moral character to be able to do this. Because you have to think about, what will this person say? What will this person not say? And how will it be said? So as Nicholas points out, to me, that is characterization, seems also to exercise us in the style of letter writing. Since in that there is need of foreseeing the character of those sending letters and those to whom they are sent. In other words, this is the skill of reading between the lines. What's really being said? Okay. Description is basically an ordered description to bring the subject clearly before the mind's eye. And this might be of persons, actions, times, places, animals, plants, etc. This one, frankly, I don't think that there is a lot of moral element to it, and I don't think there needs to be. As I said, not all writing has to be exclusively focused on the moral element, but this is part of, again, the larger picture. How are you going to defend things in court? 10 is the thesis. This inquires into a debatable question. Again, we're not talking about your personal opinion, but something that we might be able to debate for the purpose of truth. Okay? It argues a general point. So the classic example that most of these textbooks would give is the question of should one marry versus the gymnasia exercise of hypothesis. So this is later on that you would argue a specific point, such as should Cato marry. Okay, so this is arguing in the abstract, in a sense, about this. And by now it's really assumed that the moral element is integral to the argument. Now, how do you apply morality to life? And not implying that marriage is necessarily a moral issue, but that's going to be part of how you're going to address this. What does this do for us? This is the first of the Progymnasmata exercises to consider both sides of an issue. So we've done some comparison and other things, but here you're going to consider for it, and you're also going to look at what are the arguments that people are going to make against it, and how do I start to defend against those as well. So you have a pronomen, introduction, narration, proof, but you also have a refutation and an epilogue. The last of the Progymnasmata exercises, before you go on to the full things, is the proposal of or opposition to laws. So this just simply argues for or against a legislative proposal in general terms. These are not necessarily completely made up things, but you're not in the actual Senate. You're not debating a hot topic of the day necessarily, but a specific thing that you're given. This draws upon all your previous knowledge from all the other exercises, but as we'll see in this little quote by Quintilian, it presumes that laws should uphold what is morally right. It's just integral that morality is part of the purpose for writing and speaking. So Quintilian says the most generally applicable questions are whether it is right and whether it is expedient. And I think he probably means them very specifically in that order. Who cares if it's expedient if it's not right? We need to know first, is it right, before we talk about whether it's expedient. And then that kind of drops you off, ready to take on the full art of writing declamations, preparing for a career in the civic world. Regardless of whether that's the end place for all of our students today, probably isn't. I think there's a lot of useful things in here. And I'm sorry I don't have a lot of time to go into the practical aspects of it. I will say that there are a number of published curricula that are now providing you guidance on how to teach the Progymnasmata. Lots of strengths and weaknesses. I can talk about those sometime if you catch me. I think I've got 4 minutes. So I can answer a few questions if you have on that or anything else. Yes?
Specifically, I deal with quite young students. So in preparing for this type, is it good for me to have them start memorizing axioms so that when they get there that they have an arsenal of them before they get there, before they're able to truly understand the depth?
Yes, I think that's wonderful. I think small children, you stock their mind with as many great things as you can. So the fables and stories and history and maxims, the more of that they have at their command, the easier it will be. Because if students don't have anything in their mind, they can go look, but Google doesn't help you as much on this as they might like to think it would. So, absolutely.
And in their practice of oration, they can probably start doing that very first activity, retelling the fable stories.
Yes.
So that would be another great way that I could help them before they get to you.
That is a great way to do it. We found at our preschool that for whatever reason, more and more children are not necessarily able to just listen to a story and retell it. And if they don't have that skill, you can't progress on to anything else. So absolutely, that is wonderful, wonderful work with children as soon as they're ready. Yes?
I mean, this is a really obvious question, but I just want to know what your answer to it is. Why do we want to do Progymnasmata work with our students?
Well,
6th, 7th, 8th, high school.
Yeah,
what is our goal?
This is why I just dropped us off where I did. I think we should continue to think about how this fits in all together, because it is we are not in a society where you need to defend your life, as in Athens, or where we don't have most people going, this training only for people who are going to be in the Roman elite. On the other hand, if we have students that are going to go on to any kind of high school or college writing, I think this really provides very good tools. Once I started doing some of these, I could look back at work I had done as a tutor in writing centers, both in undergraduate and graduate school, and think, if people knew these things, they would know how to write basic argumentative essays, thesis statements, and the types of proof that you can use. I think that regardless of what we're doing, they provide very, very useful pieces that you can put together. They provide an ordered way of thinking, but I think there's more we can think about.
Even if
as well.
they're not going to go on and do a lot of writing
It's teaching them how to think, how to interact with people, what is good, all things that we learn. Yeah.
Just on that, eloquence is not just about the written word. I would argue that everyone is going to go off and write at some point, but more importantly, all people are going to be speaking to one another.
Mm-hmm.
And that art of speaking has really been all lost. This
Yes.
is one of the sets of tools we have to develop that, and we introduce that into our culture.
Yes, and I do think that the thought of speaking to your neighbor for the purpose of the neighbor's good, not just because I want to give my personal rant on Facebook or I just want to text you with whatever stuff, but thinking about the other person. You're absolutely right. It's crucial for a civilization to exist.
It seems to me there's almost an inherent danger if you're using maxims or proverbs, fables or Old Testament stories or narrations from the Bible, that there's a danger of going into moralizing.
Of going to
Moralizing.
moralizing, yeah.
Is that, how do you guard against that?
So I think that how you guard against that is you don't stop with those exercises. And I talk about it fairly openly with my students because, so I give them lots of examples of maxims and things. And in fact, probably the most shocking example that I give them is from the Apollonius's example of a maxim or a Kriya essay. He gives this fantastic maxim about how poverty is so bad that you should go throw yourself off a cliff instead. And we kind of talk about it like, whoa, I said, yeah, I don't condone this, okay? We don't take all maxims right at face value and say, well, it's a maxim, it is true, I will apply it to my life. You think about it. And I talk to them about the fact that every maxim is going to have a limit to how far it's applicable. Take any maxim you want, and there's going to be some case in which it probably doesn't apply. So you have to be discerning enough about that. So I start talking to them about it young, and I think if you continue through all of these things, you start to see that that there's nothing that fits every situation, and that you cannot just draw one conclusion from something. As soon as we start going to literary or historical characters, you can see pretty easily moralizing breaks down really fast. I can call Martin Luther a virtuous man, and I think this is probably true, but we're not going to go very far before we see some things about him that are not so virtuous as well. So, talk about it with students.
Could I get your email, because I wasn't able to get handouts?
Oh, yes. Yes. I can get it in case you may use it. It's heather.c.judd@gmail.com. You're welcome. All right, I'll leave these books here if anybody wants to look at these, and I'm glad to answer any other questions, but I think we're out of time, so I will let you go.